These slides are all about producing data. So as we talk about producing data, we'll discuss variable types and their roles. We'll talk about two different types of studies, observational studies and experimental studies. Observational studies include sampling from a population, sample surveys, and confounding variables. Experimental studies will discuss control, randomization, and replication, and we'll also have a discussion about ethics when it comes to experimental studies. Finally, we'll discuss association and correlation versus causation. So some terminology that we already know. We know the population is the entire group of individuals about which we want information. And the sample is the part of the population from which we actually collect the data. Up until now, we've been talking about descriptive statistics, where we describe and explore the data obtained from the sample. But as we've been talking about, we're moving toward this idea of inferential statistics, where we use the data from the sample to make inferences about the population. So what we need to do now is determine how to collect the data that we will analyze. So the data collection techniques you use will determine the scientific validity of your study, what types of conclusions you can draw regarding relationships among variables. And data collection is usually done in the context of a study. So there are two types of studies, observational and experimental. And we need some new terminology to describe these two types of studies. So make sure you have your notes outline. As we go through the remaining slides, you'll be writing down any definition, filling in examples, and I will collect this guided notes worksheet for a grade when I see you on Wednesday of next week. So we've talked about variable types. We know we have two main types of variables. We have the categorical variables and we have the quantitative variables. What we need to discuss now are the roles those variables can play. And there are also two main types of roles. A variable can either be explanatory, we think of those as our independent variables, or it can be a response variable. We think of those as our dependent variables. We are almost always interested in relationships among variables. For instance, does a certain drug cure a disease? Does being a member of a particular group suggest it might be more likely to hold a certain view or opinion? Are cars with a higher center of gravity more likely to be involved in accidents? And is there a relationship between SAT English and SAT math scores? These are just a few examples of the types of questions we hope to answer with statistics. Sometimes variables can be identified as explanatory or response variables. So a response or dependent variable measures the outcome of a study. An explanatory or independent variable may explain or influence changes in a response variable. And in some cases, it doesn't make sense to classify variables as explanatory or response, but it is reasonable to explore a relationship, i.e. an association or correlation between the variables. So let's look at some examples. In each of the following examples, we want to identify the individuals in the study, any variables and their type, and their role. And sometimes there might be different answers. So let's look at the first question. Does a certain drug cure a disease? So who are the individuals that we're interested in? Well, they would be the people who have this disease. And we have two variables here. We have whether or not a person takes a certain drug, and whether or not their disease was cured. Which one of those do you think is trying to explain an outcome? So which one is the explanatory and which one is the outcome? So we said the individuals are the people with the disease. The explanatory would be whether a person gets the drug or not. And the response would be whether or not the disease is cured. Both of those, because they are yes or no questions, did we get the drug or not? Is the disease cured or not? Both of those would be categorical variables. Let's look at another one. Does being a member of a particular religious group suggest it might be more likely to hold a certain view or opinion? So if you'd like to pause the video here and try to identify the individuals and the variables, do that, and then unpause the video and check your answer against mine. Okay, so the individuals are the people. The explanatory variable would be what religious affiliation the person has. And the response would be whether the person has a certain opinion or not. And again, religious affiliation and whether or not you have a certain opinion, both of those would be categorical variables. But the idea here is that we're trying to determine if religious affiliation explains the response of holding a certain opinion. Are cars with a higher center of gravity more likely to be involved in accidents? Pause the video and try to identify individuals and the variables. So in this case, we're not talking about people, we're talking about cars. So the individuals here are the cars, and the explanatory variable would be the height of the center of gravity of the car. Height is a measurable number, so that would be a quantitative variable. And the response is whether the car was in an accident or not. Since that's a yes or no question, that would be a categorical variable. And finally, is there a relationship between SAT English and SAT math scores? So the individuals here would be the people taking the SAT, but it doesn't really quite make sense to identify one as explanatory or response because we sit down and take the SAT all at one time. So we do have the two variables, SAT English and SAT Math. Both of those scores are measurable numbers, so we would say they are quantitative variables. But like we said, it doesn't make a lot of sense to classify as explanatory or response, but there is probably some correlation there. Okay, so an observational study is a study in which we observe individuals and measure variables of interest, but we do not attempt to manipulate any of the variables. We just want to measure the variables as they naturally occur. And the purpose of an observational study is to describe some group or situation. For example, US Census, opinion polls, or studies that observe the behavior of animals in the wild. Each of these are examples of observational studies. We also have experimental studies. An experimental study is one in which we deliberately manipulate or influence explanatory variables, and this is called imposing a treatment on the individuals. And we call it a treatment even if we're not talking about medical treatments. Anything that we do to impose or influence an explanatory variable is called a treatment. In an experimental study, the researcher controls the explanatory variables. And the purpose here is to determine if the treatment causes a change in response variables. So examples of experimental studies include clinical drug trials or psychological experiments. So just to be clear, an observational study, we are just observing, and all we can do is describe some correlation between variables. But with an experimental study, we're hoping to determine causation. We're hoping to determine if treatment causes a change in the response variables. So I'm going to pause the video here. I'm going to pick back up in part 2. So find part 2 of the video and continue watching.